Lotus Under the Citadel. Chapter 1. Lanterns over the Red River. On the night the Red River swallowed the moon, Linh carried a paper lantern that made a trembling pond of light at her feet. The wind pushed at the gauze of her ow-too thun and fingered the bamboo ribs of the lantern until it hummed. On the distant iron ribs of the bridge, all angles and cold metal, the night watch made their rounds and called to each other in French. The cries drifted down, clipped and strange, like birds that had learned a new grammar. Hanoi's streets were a calligrapher's scroll. Strokes of alleyways, sudden flourishes of courtyards, the steady black bar of the dike. At the edge of the old quarter, where tinsmiths slept behind shutters and the scent of star anise soaked into walls, she slipped through a gate to the back room of her father's shop. The signboard read, "Bach Viet van Fong Pom," but the back room was not for paper. It was for whispers. "Take off your shoes," her brother said without looking up, "and shut the gate carefully." Bao's ink-stained fingers moved over a stack of slim books wrapped in rough cloth. He had been handsome even as a child, with cheekbones like almonds. Now worry had sharpened him further. Linh placed the lantern on the floor. A yellow circle leaped to the ceiling and found the ancestor tablet above the low altar, the gilt name blurring in trembling light. She undid the clasp at her nape and let a string of blue glass beads fall into a ceramic dish beside the joss sticks. Her mother had given her the beads and said, "For courage. So you remember the sea can be carried around your neck." Her mother had died during the floods 6 years ago. Everything since had tasted of river silt. "I have to go back out," Linh said. "The one's for the girls' class." The printer smudged the last page. "You can't tell a long S with that blot." Bao's mouth tilted. "Always a teacher, always a sister," she corrected. "If we do this, we do it correctly." She had learned patience from the brush. Lift here, press there. Leave white space for breath. He tied a cloth around the stack and slid it toward her. In the corner, under straw mats, a crate of bottles clinked softly when a rat skittered. The shop's front room smelled of ink and raw paper. The back room smelled of sweat and fear. "They've shut the free school," Bao said, his voice low. "Officially." The notice went up this afternoon. Linh felt the words like a hand over her mouth. Dong Kin Nye Thuk had been a flame in a glass box. Modern learning, taught in the mother tongue, arithmetic and ethics and geography, girls included. She had led 3 classes there in the evenings, girls with careful braids who lifted their faces when Linh asked questions as if they were sunflower heads following the Sunday. "They shut the doors," Bao went on, "and then they arrested Teacher Kwang." "The geometry teacher?" Linh asked, though she knew. Bao's hand was tight on the twine. "For sedition," he said, "for teaching what exists." The lantern's flame shivered as if a gust had found it. Linh gathered the books and fitted them into the woven basket along with a bundle of chalk. She fixed the strap across her chest and straightened. "Then we will teach what exists elsewhere," she said. "Hanoi is larger than their notice. And I'm not a bast." "You are bold," Bao murmured. He touched the blue beads where they gleamed faintly like a night market stall's wares. "Take them," he said impulsively. "You know I don't wear them outside," she said. "They catch the light." "Let them," Bao said, but his smile was strained. "There have been more searches. They say the tricolor looks into wells." Linh swatted his shoulder, a gesture from childhood. They had lived then in a one-room house by the marsh, the walls patched with broken ceramic and patience. Their mother had sung boat songs while sewing shirt cuffs for the French who preferred Vietnamese hands to mend their linen in secret. The years had grown wool around those memories, soft and pricking at once. She stepped outside and pulled the gate until the latch caught. The air was wet enough to drink. From the river came the hoot of a steamer. From the bridge, a winking lantern like a remote star. She turned toward Hangdao Street, keeping to shadows. The basket settled at her hip like a sleeping baby. She had learned the habits of patrols. When soldiers grew lazy with cigarettes, when youths with red sashes swaggered too loudly to listen, when a clerk in a white suit could be made to turn his head with a small complaint about a missing bill of sale. At the corner near the silk market, two men stepped from an alley. Their hats were cocked. Their shirts were white in the way of people who did not wash them themselves. Their eyes slid over Lynn and settled on the basket. "Good evening, mademoiselle," one of them said in French. He wore a small mustache like a pencil sketch. "What have you there?" "Chalk," Lynn said in careful French. Her father had insisted she learn enough to bargain for paper without being cheated. It felt strange in her mouth, like a borrowed instrument. "I am a teacher." "A teacher of what?" The second man said in Vietnamese roughly. He was Vietnamese himself, his red sash loose on his hips. "Of loyalty or of lies?" Lynn meandered her smile the way a fish meanders down a canal. "Of letters, which can be arranged into both," she said. "Gentlemen, I am late." The mustached man's interest sharpened at her French and then slid away, as if he had remembered she was not a woman who appeared at the opera or the soirees by the lake. The sash man was more interested in being powerful under an awning of darkness. "Late for what?" he said. "A wedding," Lynn lied without blinking. "Would you like to meet my aunt? She has many questions about the census forms. She believes the word household includes her shrimp pond." The mustache laughed despite himself. The sash man hesitated. He was young, and youth often believes it is safer to laugh with the superior laugh rather than to insist. He made a small show of stepping back, the way a door does when a person has already pushed it. Lynn walked on before they could reconsider, past the tinsmiths, past the lacquer workshop, across a yard where dogs slept like folded shirts. She met the first girl outside a temple, where the offered bananas were too ripe, and a lizard darted between the altar legs. "Miss Lynn," the girl whispered, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "They say there will be no more school." "There is school in any room with space for blackboard," Lynn whispered back. "Tell the others." "Alley of the Shredded Bamboo, second courtyard. I will be there when the lantern above the bridge is in the middle." The girl's eyes, clever as sparrows, darted. She bowed and ran, more leaf than girl in the wind. Lynn stepped into the temple long enough to touch the bronze bell with her middle finger. The bell was cold. The monks had long since retreated into the practicalities of rice and repairs. To keep a temple standing required nails in the end as well as devotion. The Alley of the Shredded Bamboo had been named for the mats its residents made to dry fish and feed babies. It was damp and smelled of the river, and those who lived there considered themselves lucky when cholera took someone they did not like. It had a second courtyard that was really a widened space between two houses built stubbornly close to each other. In that courtyard, a woman with a red scarf ground rice on a stone. A one-eyed man trimmed a rooster's spurs with a sharp knife. Lynn set the basket down, knelt and tied her hair with a strip of cloth. She took chalk and a thin slate from the basket and wrote, "We begin with the names of the rivers." The words were careful, each letter rather than each character. Kwokngu had become the rebel's brush. No one could confiscate thought if it was already inside the skull, and letters were ladders. Girls arrived like dawn arriving, not everywhere at once, but first in corners, and then in a wash of light. Han with the missing front tooth, Mai with her baby brother on her back, Anne with a streak of fish scales across her cheek. Linh counted them in her head. Not the way the census would count, but the way a hen counts her chicks. 14. Today, she said, we learn the Red River's names. She wrote, Song Kai, Song Thao, Song Hong. She said them aloud, making the tones clear, the way her mother had made songs clear. The French call it fleuve rouge, but in your mouth, your father's mouth, your grandmother's mouth, it has many names. You must know them all. She moved between the girls, adjusting grips on slates, fixing lips into correct shapes. It felt like nothing so much as washing rice, lifting and lowering the grains until they were clean enough to cook. She told them the story of the giant who had thrown rocks to form islands, and the way the river hairpin turned where it met a stubborn cliff. She told them about the bridge, its iron bones brought from afar and riveted together with sweat, and how it shone when the sun found it. Who can tell me how many spans it has? She asked. Mai's hand went up, then dropped. She had been told too often not to answer. Linh nodded to her. 12. Mai said too softly, but the river is wider than that. The bridge has to pretend it has longer arms. Good, Linh said, and the courtyard warmed. She was careful never to say what would bring soldiers. She did not say that bridges could be for crossing and for breaking. She did not say that 12 could become 11 and back to 12 again in another time. The chalk dust was intimate on her fingers. Now, she said, we practice. Write your name, then write the river. They bent to their slates, and the sound was the sound of locusts in dry grass. Scratch, scratch. The woman with the red scarf watched from her rice grinder, her body rocking. The one-eyed man leaned in his doorway, the rooster under his arm like a red bouquet. When the lantern above the bridge came to the middle, as if it had entered the central beat of a heart, Linh heard the sound of boots. They were French boots with Vietnamese feet inside them. The courtyard learned to be small. Linh stood straight. Bow's warning beat inside her like another pulse. More searches. The men entered in single file, one with a red sash, one with a mustache, and another taller man whose uniform hung as if it belonged to a larger brother. Behind them, a fourth, a Frenchman with light eyes and a face that was not yet finished with youth. He wore no mustache and no scorn. He carried a camera. Evening, the mustache said, almost jaunty. He recognized Linh and seemed faintly disappointed she had not turned into a different woman. He looked around at the girls. A wedding? Linh lifted her chin. A lesson in reading. In reading what? The sash man said. He seemed glad to have caught her out in her earlier lie. In reading The Fall of Governments? He enjoyed the word governments without knowing its weight. The large uniformed man shifted, embarrassed by his own size. The Frenchman with the camera adjusted the strap on his neck and said in French, "Let them continue. I will make sure the girls' faces are not in the photograph." Linh surprised herself by answering in French, "You will not photograph my students." His eyes, which had been traveling and cataloging lamplight, chalk, the crude altar under the eaves, paused at her. "I said I would not," he said gently, and then, in careful Vietnamese, "I respect your class." The mustache man glanced at him and said, "Monsieur Marchand is new. The name fell into the courtyard, and Saturday he sees bridges where we see trouble. Monsieur Marchand." Linh tucked the name like a chalk stub into the pocket of her mind. She kept her face still. "We teach geography," she said, "and letters. This is not a crime." "What is a crime changes," the sash man said dangerously, Today it is geography. Tomorrow it will be the color of your scarf." The one-eyed man shifted, and his rooster made a disgruntled sound. The girls watched Lin's face instead of the uniforms. Lin felt the old instinct to kneel, to make herself less visible. Her mother had taught her that too, how to leave a room in a fire. She held still. She knew how a teacher's body could be a blackboard. "We are teaching the names of the river," she said, and tapped the slate. "In the language of our mouths." "Your mouths," the mustache corrected. There was sweat at his temples. He wanted to leave without losing face. "We will take your chalk," he said finally, "and this slate. You can resume your wedding tomorrow." He reached for the chalk, perhaps glad to take something that would not become a headline. Lin put her hand on the chalk first. The moment was ridiculous. Two adults holding a stick of chalk like a wishbone. She let go. The girls did not stir. The Frenchman, Monsieur Marchand, had been silent. He shifted again and raised his camera not to his eye but to his chest, as if he were showing it to someone. "May I photograph the bridge?" he asked, in Vietnamese so careful it felt like a man carrying a bowl of soup without spilling. "From your courtyard. The angle is rare." "Photograph the bridge," the sash man mocked, but the mustache shrugged. "Photograph the bridge," he agreed. "And hurry." Monsieur Marchand stepped deeper into the courtyard, careful of the baskets and the rooster, and lifted the camera. Lin watched him over the girls' heads. He did not look at them. He looked through them to the iron line of the bridge, its distance folded into his lens. He took one photograph, then another. The second time, as he lowered the camera, his eyes found Lin again, and this time they lingered. He startled slightly, as if he had seen her twice, once with the camera and once with his eyes. Perhaps the two images did not match. He stepped back and nearly trod on a bowl. Lin's hand went out without thinking and caught his elbow. His sleeve was rough under her fingers. He looked down at her hand. She let go as if it had burned her. "Merci," he said. "You are welcome," Lin said stiffly, and then added in Vietnamese, "Take your pictures and leave." He lowered his voice. "Your class, where will you teach next, if they have closed?" "You are a soldier," she said. "You tell me." She did not soften it. He flinched, a small tightening at the corner of his mouth. She had hit a place he had not armored yet. He looked at the girls fast, an involuntary flick, and then back at the bridge. He took one more photograph of something beyond his reach and stepped away. The mustache man held up the slate as if it were evidence. He squinted at the words. "Song Hong," he read aloud slowly, his foreign mouth clumsy with tones. "Red River. There, you see? A dangerous lesson." He laughed in a way that asked for someone else to join him. The large uniformed man smiled because he had learned to do that. They left with the chalk and the slate as if those objects would do the work on their own. The courtyard refilled with breath. The woman at the grinder let out a sound that was not precisely a laugh. The one-eyed man put the rooster down gently. Lin felt suddenly very tired. The weight of the basket on her hip bit a bruise into the bone. She looked at the girls. They were thin and serious, and each one burned like a coal at a different heat. "We will meet again," she said softly. "We will meet by the tinsmith's door, or in the back of the fish market, or under the banyan where the road bends. We will call it a wedding if anyone asks. Bring your mouths, your hands, and the names you already know." They nodded, one by one, as if they had entered into a pact. They melted away into mothers' kitchens and brothers' errands, carrying the lesson like a wrapped cake. Lin lifted the basket again, lighter now. She stood long enough to see the lantern above the bridge drift from the center. Night reshaped itself. She wrapped her shawl tighter and walked back through the alleys. At the corner near the silk market, the sash man's voice reached her again, but it was only his echo in her head. When she reached her father's gate, she found it unlatched. Her heart fell and then rebounded. Bao had a habit of leaving it so when he was most anxious, as if a closed gate would trap bad luck inside. Inside the shop, the ancestor tablet watched gravely. The blue glass beads lay in their dish like pooled sky. Bao was not there. On the counter, under a stone used to flatten paper curls, someone had placed a folded notice. Linh recognized the pale blue stamp of the administration. The Vietnamese words were plain enough, the French beneath them more officious. She smoothed the paper, her fingers not quite hers. Summons for Bao, son of Trin and Huang, vendor of unlicensed materials, to present himself at the Office of Public Order at dawn. Failure to present will be considered admission of guilt. Linh? Her father's voice came from the doorway that led to the courtyard, thin with age and with the opium that had become a towel he could no longer wring out. He leaned on the doorframe, small and furious. They took your brother. They came with the notice, and then did not wait for the dawn. The words were a slap and then a hand held out too late. Linh put both hands on the counter, then placed one palm flat on the ancestor tablet. The wood was warm. Her mother's name looked back with its permanence that mocked. "How many?" she asked. "Two with red sashes and one French," her father said. The French one didn't speak. He looked at the books and didn't speak. I would have spit at him if I had spit to spare. Linh saw briefly, with dangerous clarity, Monsieur Marchand's face in the courtyard. She saw him lowering the camera, saw the way he had flinched under her words. She pushed the image away. It was as useless as pity for a knife. "If we do not get Bao out by noon," her father went on, hopelessly practical, "they will say they kept him because no one asked. If we ask, they will keep him because someone asked." He laughed once into his sleeve, and it was the sound of silk tearing. What a clever country we are to invent such choices. "Not our country," Linh said before she could swallow it. She regretted it at once. It made the air thinner. She lifted the blue beads and held them a moment. Their cheap glass warmed quickly in her palm. "I will go at dawn," she said. "I will ask." "You are a girl," her father said, without cruelty. "They will not listen." "They will listen as much as they would to your cough," Linh said, and kissed the top of his head where the hair had thinned to a monk's circle. "Sleep." He made a sound that was not assent and not refusal. He moved toward the mat as if it had become very far away. Linh took the notice and folded it until its edges met like cleanly cut paper. She did not sleep. She sat in the back room with the books around her like a small city. She lit a second candle whose smoke made a dragon and then a straight line. She made a list. The names of men who owed her father favors, the names of women who had married those men and who might care more than the men did, the name of a clerk who had once put money back into the till when he thought no one saw him. She wrote the names in Vietnamese and in French, and then she crossed them out, because the sight of their vulnerability offended her. The night collapsed and expanded. When the rooster in the alley of the shredded bamboo crowed, the sound traveled on the roof tiles and into the shop like a small hammer. At the Office of Public Order, the queue was already a spine in the courtyard. Women with babies, a man with a stitched headscarf, a boy whose arms were too long for his body. Linh wore her plainest brown owl and braided her hair simply, like a rope that had a job. She left the beads in the dish and felt naked without them. Behind the counter, under a portrait of a man with a beard like the root of a banyan, a clerk sorted papers as if their lives were weights. Linh stepped forward when it was not her turn, because she had learned that sometimes a voice could create a turn. "My brother," she said, "taken for a misunderstanding. We have a summons, but he has been summoned already." "Already, eh?" The clerk did not look up. "Name?" "Bow," she said, and then gave his full name, the way her father did when he wanted to sound as if he could summon thunder. "Son of Trin and Huang, bookseller." "Ah," the clerk said, as if she had asked him the price of guavas. He flicked through pages. "Booksellers sell books, sometimes to the wrong eyes. He is in the back. He will be questioned." He looked up then, and Linh saw he was younger than she had expected, with a scab at his lip from a shaving cut. "If you want him sooner, you must speak to the monsieur." "What monsieur?" Linh said, though she knew what a monsieur meant here. The clerk flicked his chin toward a door. Inside the room beyond the door, the light was different, as if the window pane had been washed more often. There was a table with a map pinned to it by knives. Behind the table, a man sat with a pen and a glass of water slowly warming. He was not the mustache, nor the large uniform. He was the Frenchman from the courtyard, without his camera. He had a jacket that fit and a caution that did not. For a heartbeat, she forgot the French for good morning. Then her mouth found it. "Bonjour, monsieur." She kept her hands at her sides, the way you keep hands by your sides when a dog may or may not bite. He stood politely, the way polite men stand even when they intend to be impolite. "Mademoiselle." It was not mockery. He gestured to the chair. "Please." "I will not sit," she said. "My brother." "Bow," he said. He had read the notice or memorized it. "He is safe." "Safe," Linh repeated, tasting the word for poison. "What does safe mean when he is not with me?" "In a room," he said, after a breath, "with a guard who owes me a favor." He did not say how he collected favors. "Then you can return him," Linh said, and felt the heat in her face. She wanted to control it, to pour it into a porcelain cup, but it spilled. "You can return him to the place where safe means not being in a room you do not choose." He looked at her and did not look away. It was not a challenge. It was watching a river in flood. "Your class," he said, "you teach girls." "I teach them what belongs to them already," she said. "So they remember it is theirs." He shifted, a slight adjustment, as if to redistribute weight. "The school was closed," he said, and it felt as though he were apologizing for rain. "I was told." "You were told," she said, more softly now, because she had seen the flinch before. "And what did you tell yourself?" He made a small sound that could have been the beginning of a laugh or a cough. "I told myself I am here to build bridges." "And so you put your camera between you and what the bridge crosses," she said. He did not defend himself at once. The map behind him showed the river as a red line, obedient to ink, curving where instructed. "I can release your brother into your keeping," he said, "if you will sign this paper promising that he will present himself again if required." "Required for what?" She could not help herself. He opened his hands helplessly, and it was then she realized he had long fingers with ink stains that were not from coffee. He wrote, "Then, for answers we may not know how to ask," he said. She wanted to hate him efficiently. It would be cleaner, but the room was untidy with his earnestness. "And if I do not sign?" "He stays," he said, and there was no sentiment in it, and he will sign tomorrow after a worse night. She stared at the paper. It had blank lines where the river of their family would flow. She did not believe in signatures. Her mother's name had been written on nothing that the world counted. "I will sign," she said, because refusing would be a luxury, and luxury was a kind of complicity. He slid the pen toward her. She wrote carefully, because letters mattered even on a paper that did not deserve them. Her hand did not tremble. When she finished, he blotted the ink and stood. "Wait here," he said. "I will fetch him." He paused at the door. Mademoiselle Linh. She had not told him her name. He must have asked the clerk, or someone else had said it without knowing. It cost them something. "Your girls," he said. "Be careful." "Careful is not the same as silent," she said. "I know," he said, and surprised himself. He left. She counted to 100 and then to 100 again. When the door opened, Bao stepped in, his face stubbornly unchanged. He had a bruise under one eye, like a thumbprint. He saw Lin and let his shoulders drop for the space of a breath, then straightened. "You signed," he said, as if she had sold him for a buffalo. "I signed to bring you home," she said. "To plan?" He tilted his head in reluctant gratitude. "The monsieur," he said. "Half a question." "Building bridges," she said. Bao's mouth quirked. "We will learn to cross without paying." They left by the courtyard. The air had already turned toward noon, hot and practical. Lin felt the strange relief of sun on her skin after a room where language bent. She did not look back until they reached the end of the lane. When she did, she saw him at the doorway, sleeves rolled, the map behind him like a rumor. He was watching the way a man watches the river when he has begun to understand it is larger than his job description. At home, their father was asleep on the mat. Lin set water to boil and washed Bao's bruise with a cloth. It was an intimacy they had not had since childhood. He hissed, and she said, "Hold still or I'll marry you to a shrimp pond." He laughed, then caught the notice on the counter. "We teach tonight," he said, as if the paper had confirmed it. "In the courtyard behind the fish market," she said, "and then in the abandoned storeroom near the brick kiln. We move like a school of fish. We write on the undersides of trays. We hide the chalk in our hair." Bao's eyes warmed. "Sister," he said, "you will one day make a general very tired." "I have made one clerk tired already," she said, but she thought of the Frenchman's ink-stained fingers and the way he had said careful. That evening, as the river took the day in its mouth and chewed, she tied the blue beads around her neck. They lay cold at first and then matched her skin. In the mirror's warped surface, the beads looked like fragments of sky caught at her collarbones. She thought of her mother's thin hands and the way they had mended linen as if repairing nations. Under the bridge, she found the girls. They had multiplied. News runs faster when hunted. She wrote on the back of a shutter the names of the stars. The men with red sashes passed by without looking up. They were late for their tea. The mustache man was with them, his laugh a threadbare coat. No camera hung at his companion's neck. Later, after the lesson, men from the market came and went with baskets like truncated moons. The bridge oiled itself with shadows. Lin walked alone for a short stretch to clear her head. Somewhere, a song began in a house, the boat song of her childhood, foolish and brave. She followed it until it intersected with the road by the banyan. He was there, under the tree, as if he had been penciled into the page after the ink had dried. He had no uniform jacket, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled again. He looked almost like a man who could be mistaken for a clerk at the approach of a hard month. Mademoiselle Linh, he said. He stood as if to be ready to take flight if she asked. You found my name, she said. Did you photograph it? The beads at her throat caught a small piece of moon and held it hostage. He took the question into himself and did not hurry to answer. I asked the clerk, he said. He said your name is what girls say now when they trust each other. Then he is a poet, she said dryly, and will be arrested next. She shifted her weight, ready to leave him with his tree. If you are here to warn me, save your breath for your camera. He looked at the beads as if they were a riddle. I am here because the bridge is not the only thing worth looking at, he said, and because I wanted to say, he sought the word in Vietnamese and did not find it. He found it in French. I am sorry for what you did or for what you are, she asked. For the distance between, he said. She almost laughed. It would have been kinder to him if she had. She stepped around him, careful to give him neither hope nor an easy enemy. The distance is a river, she said. You will build your bridge, we will swim. He watched her pass, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a coin sewn into a hem, present, secret. The night gathered up the lanes and folded them neatly, like shirts for a journey. The moon climbed, a smuggler, across the iron, and in the city that preferred its shadows obedient, new names were being learned in mouths that would not forget them. Chapter 2. The Map and the Needle. During the weeks after Bao's release, Hanoi learned to hold its breath. Notices bloomed on walls like bad flowers. Rumors moved in teacups. The market women traded more than fish and cloth. They traded time, measuring it by how many breaths it took a patrol to pass from one alley to the next. Linh taught in pockets of air. She became expert at folding an hour and a half when footsteps approached, at turning a blackboard into a shutter into part of a wall. Bao stood in doorways and did not smoke because it made his hands shake. At first, the arrests came like accidents, one man unlucky, another too loud, but soon they had a pattern. It was a pattern Linh could have traced with her finger. Printers, teachers, the young who had written poems too near politics. A friend of Bao's, a quiet boy who had learned to carve wooden stamps of birds, was taken with ink on his wrist in the shape of a feather. The next morning, Bao sat with his head in his hands over a plate of rice he did not eat. They will break the free school twice, he said into his palms. First the doors, then the mouths. Then we will learn to speak with our hands, Linh said, because sometimes courage had to be a game you invented. She reached into the basket of thread and lifted a skein the color of river mud. Bring me the map. Bao looked up, already caught. Which map? The one of the river, the old way, she said. The one our grandfather drew on rice paper and kept under his mat because he did not trust the men who printed maps. Their grandfather had been a ferry pilot for 15 years and had known the weight of each bend of the river. He had drawn it as if it were a grandmother's braid. Bao fetched the map from the wooden trunk. It smelled faintly of camphor and a story. Linh unfolded it and smoothed the lines with her palm. We will sew it, she said, into the lining of my owl. She grinned at his astonishment. It is not contraband to wear a river. You will prick your fingers, Bao said softly. I pricked them anyway, she said, and threaded the needle. They worked at the back table in the long light of late afternoon, the air full of dust that looked like unfallen snow. Linh bent over the silk and counted threads and breaths. Bao read aloud to keep the needle steady in her mind. He read geography in Vietnamese, then in French, and then he read a passage from a Chinese poem their mother had loved, about a boatman who could hear fish speak. The stitches gathered the river into being. Small, straight runs where the current was stubborn, tiny curves where the river remembered it had invented a bend to wash a village more kindly. When Linh pricked herself, she pressed her finger to the cloth and said, "Yes, yes," as if the river needed her blood to sign the agreement. At night, she wore the owl with its secret map and walked to the fish market. The courtyard behind it had high walls and a door that stuck. In the lamplight, she showed the girls how to fold a piece of paper into a box that could carry a message small enough to get past a soldier's glance. She taught them arithmetic by counting scales, chemistry by cooking rice, ethics by listening to a neighbor's grief without improving it. Sometimes she laughed, and the sound surprised her. It sounded like a woman who had learned to laugh from men's jokes and then found a better one. Monsieur Marchand appeared rarely, as if he had learned that his presence rearranged the room even when he did nothing. Once, Linh saw him from across the road, standing with his camera at a heel of hand angle that suggested he had not taken a photograph all day. He saw her, too. They did not speak. Their eyes knocked and glanced away like marbles. He had a way of looking at buildings as if they had been waiting to be recognized. Linh heard from a seamstress who broke bread for a woman who ironed shirts at the French club that he ate quickly and alone, and that he paid for wine as if the coins were his own. She also heard from the clerk with the shaving cut who had failed to heal that Marchand had given a book to a boy and taken a reprimand for it. The book had not been about politics. It had been about stars. "Why do you listen?" Bao asked when Linh repeated this. "You collect rumors the way other women collect copper hairpins." "Hairpins hold hair," Linh said. "Rumors hold rooms." And no, on a day when the heat lay on the city like a tired dog, Linh was summoned this time by a woman, which was a new kind of alarm. The woman's name was Shoan. She sold dyed cloth and had a husband who had failed to return twice, once from the war and once from the gambling table. "You sew," Shoan said without preface, appearing at the shop door with a thunderhead's urgency. "Tonight, at the house by the lake, the wife of a commissaire needs her dress mended." She spat the title like a bitter kernel. "He is the kind who believes cotton is a miracle of Christian charity." "I am not their seamstress," Linh said, "but more for the feeling of the words than the belief." "You are the kind of seamstress who can walk into a house and see how the windows latch," Shoan said. She had a dimple that appeared when she told a lie. It was absent now. "There will be a room with a desk. He keeps papers in it that are the shape of our boys." Bao looked at Linh. The bruise under his eye had faded to the color of weak tea. "We need shape," he said quietly. "We teach blindfolded." Lin's mother had taught her to sew and to watch. "This stitch," she used to say, "and this one are sisters. They go together and do not complain." Lin's fingers remembered the language of hems and seams. She tied her hair in a knot and put on her plainest shoes, the ones that made her feet look smaller than her step. Into her basket, under the thimble and the thread, she slid a piece of rice paper with an edge of the river on it. It comforted her to carry something that knew how to leave and come back. The house by the lake was white and had columns like men with their arms crossed. It smelled of military soap and dried flowers. The wife, a woman with yellow hair like silk dyed too many times, was wearing a dress that had torn under one arm. She looked at Linh as if she were a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly spoken. "You will sew here," she said in French, gesturing to a chair by the window. "I cannot be seen with a rip." "Yes, madame," Linh said, and lowered her eyes. Her mother had also taught her to make herself the right size for different rooms. "If I may have a basin of water," she added, because asking for something made her appear more ordinary. The woman pointed to a servant. The basin arrived with a cloth folded like the memory of a swan. Linh pricked her finger deliberately and let a drop of blood fall into the water to grant herself superstition. She placed the thimble and opened her basket. The thread had already been measured against the weight of the dress. She sewed. The commissaire arrived half an hour later, smelling not of battle but of polite wine. He was shorter than his doorway and moved as if he had been told as much by men who did not laugh when they said it. He gave his wife a kiss that landed on her hair and turned toward the mirror. "The ball is at 9, he said in careful French that made Linh think of marching. "Where is Henri?" "On the bridge," the wife said. "He lives there now." Lin's needle paused before she remembered that the world did not, after all, spin on Marchand's collarbone. The commissaire caught the pause with a glance and then dismissed it. "Henri," he repeated, in the tone of a man disappointed by a postcard. "Henri will learn to love regulations, or regulations will learn to love him." He looked at Linh as if he had discovered a new kind of chair. "They are so neat with their hands," he told the room. "Our women cannot be bothered, eh?" He laughed at his own joke and left the room in search of a glass that had been placed for him in expectation of himself. Linh finished the seam and tied off the thread with a neat kiss. The wife did not thank her. Gratitude would have forced a recognition. "You may go," she said, and then, "No, take these to the study. Put them on the desk." She thrust a bundle of sheets at Linh, the way one might handle soft wood that had no splinters. The study smelled of paper and a man's belief in his own hand. The desk had a leather blotter with the imprint of a family crest too expensive to belong to a man who did not own soil. On the desk, a map lay like a scandalized woman, its corners held by paperweights. Linh imagined lifting the weights and the map rolling up into a tube that could fit inside a sleeve. She placed the sheets where the wife had indicated, then allowed herself a breath and a tilt of her head. In the open drawer lay a sheaf of notices with dates and names. She did not let her eyes read them. Reading would have made them hers. Instead, she saw the shapes of letters. She saw that the list of search addresses included the alley of the shredded bamboo, that the schedule of patrols had a hole on market day at noon, that the name Bao had not yet been written. The knowledge was a taste that would not leave her tongue. She moved one paper half an inch. It was enough to see a name she could carry without screaming. Quang, the geometry teacher. A note in French, in a hand not unlike Marchand's, transferred to Nam Dinh for questioning. It was dated yesterday. She set the paper back like a sleeping baby and adjusted it so precisely a spirit level would have approved. When she turned, a man stood in the doorway. For a beat her body prepared to be a girl again, to pretend to be ignorant. Then she saw that it was Marchand, and the breath she had prepared did not fit in her chest. "Adele sent you," he said, naming the wife in French as if the name were a bird he could hold. He glanced where her hands had been, and then at her face, as if he had decided the latter was less dangerous. "Your seam is invisible." He made a small, unhelpful smile. "I am a seamstress," she said, and, because it squared the room in a way that suited his need for corners, she smiled too. "Your bridge is visible. It is designed that way," he said. He did not step into the study. He kept one shoulder against the door frame, as if he needed the wood to assert that he was as solid as a man in a room ought to be. "You shouldn't be here," he said in Vietnamese that had improved enough to be gentler. "And yet I so," she said. She felt the weight of the map on her body, a second skin. "You shouldn't be everywhere you are either." "Do you know," he said, in a tone that surprised her by its nakedness, "how many times a bridge must be painted? Every 2 years. The iron wants to return to earth. It wants to be red dust. Men teach it to remain a bridge. Do you want to remain what you are?" she asked. Her hands, she realized, were moving on the desk, fingers tracing the line where wood met leather. He followed the movement and did not comment. "I wanted to build cathedrals," he said. "Then I wanted to build anything that would stand long enough to mean something. Now I want." He stopped. "I'm sent to tell you to be careful," he said, and it sounded like an apology to his own mouth. "They will shut the market courtyard next week. They know you teach there." "How?" The question launched itself before she could teach it manners. "Because men who are afraid prefer to shut doors," he said, and it was not, she knew, a real answer. He was a door half open himself. "Move your class to the brick kiln," he said after a pause, and the words fell between them with the weight of a favor that could later become a debt. "No one thinks learning happens where things are fired. You are helping." The observation was as much to herself as to him. "I am adjusting weights," he said, and then flushed, as if the phrase had put him too near her language. From the corridor came the commissaire's voice, neat with anticipation. "Henri." He entered the study without knocking, and if Marchand had not turned in time, he would have been caught between man and door. The commissaire raised his eyebrows at the sight of Linh, and then lowered them to make the expression his. "Ah, the seamstress," he said. "You have sewn my wife closed." Linh made herself a hinge and passed by him with a bow so slight it might have been a woman adjusting a strand of hair. Marchand did not look at her as she went. She did not look at him, which was not the same as not seeing him. On the way home, she counted the lamp-posts, 12 from the lake to the shop, 3 that leaned like men, gesturing in an argument. The count settled her. Bao was waiting with a face that tried to be a question and created a plea. "They will shut the courtyard," she said without preamble. "Next week." "How do you know?" he asked. Not because he doubted, but because knowing the path of a message is as valuable as the message. "Because a man who moves in houses told me," she said. "Does it matter?" Bao's mouth shaped no and yes at once. She told him about the hole in the patrol schedule, about the address list, about the geometry teacher, the words in a lean strip. He closed his eyes as if to drink. When she finished, he opened them dry. "We will move," he said. "The kiln. We will hide chalk and bricks." "And the girls with babies?" she asked. "We will put the babies at the mouth of the kiln where it is warm," he said, thinking as he spoke. "They will sleep. We will let sleep teach." And knowed. That night, the river rose. It had been a wet summer, and the dikes had the look of men who had been awake too long. The bridge, all metal, felt the water's voice come up through its feet. Linh lay on her mat and listened to the old, tired argument between flood and land. In her sleep, she dreamed of a camera hung around a neck like a second throat. She dreamed of a map that unstitched itself from a lining and rose like a fish into the air, and of a man who reached for it and did not, at the last moment, take it. When morning came, she put her hands in the basin and touched the water to her face. The map, under her fingers in the cloth, knew where to send her feet. She walked to the kiln. The brick kiln had been abandoned, not out of disuse, but because business had outgrown its smallness. It squatted like a giant pot with its lid thrown to one side. Children already knew it as a place to hide, and once a boy had fallen asleep inside and given his mother a terror she would never forgive. The floor of the kiln was the color of old clay, and the dust on it tasted like forgetting. Linh dragged a plank into the round of the kiln to make a table. She brought a handful of chalk and a bundle of slates tied with twine. When the girls began to arrive, their feet made a hush on the dust. The kiln wrapped them in a curve of warm shadow. The smallest girl, Mai's brother, slept with his mouth open as if his dreams required it. Linh wrote on the plank, "Who owns a word?" The question glowed as if it had been placed in coals. "Each of you," Linh said, "owns your name, and you own the names of bread and water, and your father's name when you speak it with respect, and your mother's name when you say it in grief, and your children's names when you say them in worry and praise." She spoke so softly that the dust leaned in to listen. "You also own the names of places when your feet have known them. Speak them, write them." They practiced. A girl named Han wrote her name 3 times, and on the 4th time wrote it as if someone else were watching. Linh adjusted the strokes, lifted a wrist, pointed to where the letter needed a place to breathe. She thought suddenly, wildly, that she could teach the whole city under the skin of this kiln, one girl at a time, a coil of learning that could not be heard from outside. Bao appeared at the doorway with a caution that had become a habit. "A message," he murmured. "Soan says the patrol is 2 hours earlier." He did not have to say which patrol. Their lives now had the structure of a timetable. "Then we finish in half," Linh said, and the girls nodded as if there were no other way to be. When the lesson ended, Bao helped stack the slates as if bricks. He had a new nick on his thumb. Linh wanted to kiss it better the way she had when he was 5. "You are a priest of chalk," she said instead. "And you are a general of thread," he replied. And then, because their mother would have cursed them for such talk, they both laughed to ward off the omen. Outside, the wind had a new grain in it. It carried a rumor of the sea salt, tin, a blade sharpened long ago. Linh lifted her face to it and felt for a moment that she could put her mouth directly on the weather and drink. By the lake that evening, men in linen walked with women whose dresses moved like paws marks. Lanterns threw their light onto the water where fish had more sense than to surface. Linh did not mean to be there. She had gone to buy rice and found herself where the city pretended it was a softer place. She stood at the edge and looked at her reflection because it was easier than looking up. "The seamstress," someone said in French. She did not turn. In reflections, the world can be safer. You sewed without leaving a stitch. Marchand's voice was thin with irony that he had not yet learned to wear comfortably. "Your friend speaks as if women are holes to be mended," she said. "Perhaps he will learn otherwise when his papers fall through his desk." He made a sound that could have been a laugh if there had been more air in it. "You should not say such things where the water can carry them," he murmured. "Sound travels." "So do bridges," she said, and then, because she had promised herself she would never waste a meeting with him, she added, "You signed a reprimand because of a book." "I signed many things," he said, but his mouth tightened. "This one I signed in my head. The paper came later." He shifted, and his sandal grated on the stone, a sound louder than his admission. "Do you know," he said, "there are fish that leave the water to cross land? They grow legs they never needed before." "Do you think you will grow gills?" she asked. "It seems more likely." "I think," he said after a breath, "I will learn to breathe in places where breath is not offered." There was a silence in which a woman laughed in another language. Lin found it oddly merciful that she did not understand the joke. "They will close the kiln," she said, surprising herself. She had not meant to tell him even what he had told her. 6 days from now. "Then move," he said, not in command, but in admission. "We cannot always move," she said. "Children sleep. Old men have chairs that remember their weight. And, then you must have 2 chairs," he said, and she almost smiled at how French the solution was. Architecture. They stood together, not close enough to be seen together, and watched a small boat cut the lantern's reflection into lace. Lin could feel the map against her skin, as if it were a lover tracing the river with a finger. She felt the stitch line under her ribs and resisted an absurd urge to draw his hand to it and say, "Here, this curve, it is where the water decides it wants to be sky." "Tell me your name," he said suddenly. "Your full name." She hesitated long enough to taste the habit of silence. "Trin T. Lin," she said, and hearing it in her own voice made her feel more visible than she liked. He nodded as if given coordinates. "Henri Marchand," he said, though she had not asked. "Would you have guessed something else?" "I would have guessed a name with a stubborn sound," she said. "Henri is more—" She searched for a word in his language that wasn't an insult. "Soft?" he supplied, amused in spite of himself. "Bendable," she said. And the non-insult was the kindest thing she had given him. Before he could answer, the bell by the lake rang for some reason that need not concern them. People turned their heads like flowers. Lin did not. "I sold a seam today," she said. "I did not sell anything else." It was both statement and warning. He bowed, as if they were in a room where bows were expected. "I have nothing you could buy," he said. "Only a camera and a position that will ruin me or someone else." He lifted his face. "If you must choose, choose me." She blinked. The audacity was almost beautiful. "I will not choose to ruin anyone if I can help it," she said, and stepped away from his gravity. In the days that followed, the city hurried. Ox carts moved as if late to their own patience. Women rolled up mats not for sleep but for departure. The patrols changed their route and then changed it back, like men who had forgotten their lines in a play involving too many hats. Lin taught in the kiln and then in the yard behind the bamboo weavers, where the mats smelled like new rain. She taught the girls to hide sentences in recipes and to iron out fear with practice. She taught them the names of the constellations and which ones could be found over their own roofs without borrowing the sky of another country. On the 5th day, a boy came running with his chest wide open to air. He had a message from the clerk with the shaving cut. There would be a sweep through the streets by noon. Lin packed the slates with a speed that did not look like speed. She smiled at the girls as if the day were ordinary. Inside her ribs, the stitches of the map pulled. They were not fast enough. The men in red sashes appeared at the mouth of the yard like punctuation marks. "Wedding," Lin said brightly, before anyone else could speak. "You are just in time. We are making a cake of letters." She lifted a slate as if it were a tray. Beside her, Bao stood not taller, but more narrow, as if he could slide between the men and become a draft. The mustache was there, as if summoned by the idea of a crowd. He looked at the girls and found less amusement than he once had. He had learned somewhere a new way to be stern and was trying it on like a borrowed hat. "No more cakes," he said. "No more lessons." "Ah," Lin said, in genuine sorrow. "You are for starving." The one-eyed man from the courtyard had arrived too, rooster under his arm, as if he had been called by a law that required roosters at every scene. He moved closer to the girls, and the rooster made a noise like a torn kiss. Marchand was not with the men. For a moment Linh knew panic so pure it was almost a bell. Then she heard, in the distance, the strike of a hammer on bridge, the sound he would always be near. She stepped forward once, as if stepping into a river, and said, in Vietnamese for the men and in French for the mustache, "Who will you arrest? The letters, the chalk, the children's mouths, the woman with the blue beads?" The sash man said, and there it was, a line that could carry a net. She had worn the beads because courage required ornaments sometimes. She lifted a hand and touched them once, to greet the foolishness. Her brother, the mustache said, and was perhaps saving face for an earlier kindness. He lifted his chin at Bao. "You again." "I panned." "Me again," Bao said, and in the two words Linh felt the whole architecture of their childhood. The boy who stepped between her and bullies, the boy who laced the mat tighter because he believed a mat could hold very nearly anything. She put her hand on his arm in a casual, sisterly way that said nothing to the law and everything to him. Not yet. "Henri," someone called from the street. In the fluid that passed for mercy that afternoon, Marchand came around the corner with a length of rope over his shoulder and an apology already in his face. He took in the scene as one takes in a field before choosing a place to sit. He spoke to the mustache in French, too low for Linh to catch. She saw the mustache's jaw work on a word that would hurt his teeth to swallow. She watched him swallow it. "Inspection of the bridge," Marchand said then in Vietnamese, and the lie, if it was one, sounded like rail on stone. "We need the men," he added, meaning the sash men, with a shrug that said bridges outrank weddings. The yard released a breath. The men left like punctuation marks at the end of a clause that had been rewritten to be less stupid. Bao leaned forward and then back as if pulled by two ropes. Marchand stood at the edge and waited until leaving would look like part of a plan. He glanced at Linh and did not smile. He did not look at the beads because that would have made them evident. He looked at her mouth as if waiting for her to say the word that would explain him. She did not oblige. When the dust had settled in a democratic way on everyone present, the girls laughed in little bursts that had to be exercised or they would become something else. Linh sat on the plank that had been a table and put her face in her hands because sometimes even generals of thread have to practice a weakness so they can later refuse it. "What are we doing?" Bao asked quietly. His hand hovered near her shoulder and then landed lightly, as if he feared touching would make her into glass. "Swimming," she said into her palms. "We are swimming while they decide which banks belong to them." That night she went to the banyan. She did not tell herself she would see him there. In the language of her mother, the word for waiting and the word for knitting were separated only by a thread. She touched the trunk, which had learned long ago how to grow with nothing to lean on, and waited. He came. He had a smear of iron dust at his wrist and looked like a man who had lifted a thing that ought to have been lifted by three. He stood near enough for the air to have an opinion. "I did not know if I should thank you," she said, and the honesty felt like a loan. "You should not," he said. "It may increase the rate of interest." She almost smiled. "Why?" It was the small why, the one a child asks at the end of knowledge. "Because I want to see what you will do next," he said, and startled himself again with the shape of his own admission. "And because every time I do nothing I am less." "You are not nothing," she said, more gently than she intended. "You are heavy." He huffed something like agreement. "Do you know what it is to be from nowhere?" he asked suddenly. "To come from a town with no famous church, no river anyone cares to sing? I thought I would make a life by building somewhere. Then I realized I had built a place where people drown." His note. "We do not drown," she said. "We know too many words for water." Then, because there are only so many moments when a woman can afford to be kind to a man with power, she added, "You will not save me." "I know," he said at once. "You do not want that." "I do not want to be something saved," she agreed. "I want to be a person who swims and builds her own banks." "And then?" he asked. The softness of the question surprised her, as if he meant not, "What then for your movement?" but, "What then for you, Lin? At night, when the kiln is cold?" "Then," she said, and took a breath that tasted of root and iron, "I will love without asking permission." Was it Shane? The words moved through the leaves overhead and did not break. He looked up, as if reading them in the branches. "Love," he said, in the mouth of a man who had eaten bread mostly alone. "It seems the heaviest thing." "It is a boat," she said. "It cannot stand on land, but it can carry us past it." They did not speak of the rules of boats. They did not speak of France or Vietnam or the way both countries had become the kind of house where the kitchen is always on fire and the family declares itself warm. They stood at the roots of the banyan, and the night accepted their attempt to be briefly two people instead of representatives of two ways of standing in history. When he left, he did not touch her. When she left, she did not look back. Yet when they turned from separate ends of the lane to make sure the other still existed, it felt like a gesture from a shared grammar. On the 6th day, as promised by rumor, men came to nail the doors of the kiln. Someone brought a hammer to pry them open again at dusk. The hammer had belonged to her lost husband. She swung it like a prayer. Bao laughed when the nail popped and called it a small cricket. Lin, sewing a lesion in the kiln's cloth door, thought of the commissaire's study and the desk that wanted to believe paper could moth-proof the future. Quang, the geometry teacher, did not come back from Nam Dinh. The news arrived on a piece of paper that had been used to wrap fish. Lin washed the paper and let it dry on the windowsill like a pale leaf. Bao did not speak for a day and a half. When he did, he wrote on the wall in chalk, "Some men make angles smaller so more people can fit." Below it, Lin wrote, "Some women sew the space between." They left the writing there and taught under it. No one dared to erase it. It was a kind of altar that would do no one any good and everyone some. As the month turned, a letter came in a hand that did not know whether to slant. It had no seal. Inside was a single sentence in clumsy Quokengu. "The bridge is a mouth. Check its teeth on Tuesday." It took Lin a minute, then another. She looked at Bao and then went to the mirror and turned sideways. The map against her ribs blushed with her. "They will take the plank," she said, somewhere between laughter and despair. "The central span." "And what is a bridge without a span?" Bao asked, and his smile was full of a pain he did not need a priest for. "A promise," she said, and the word was not enough and too much at once. She folded the letter and put it in the seam where she kept needles. She could feel it there afterward. A stiff truth where her body bent. If she had been a different woman in a different story, she would have gone to Marchand and asked him to explain himself to himself. She would have said, "You cannot be two men at once." But a woman who carries a map against her skin learns that a river makes many islands that are not frauds of each other. On Tuesday, the city gathered at distances sanctioned by fear. Men on the bridge measured and spoke to each other with gestures, a language no school taught. Women in the lanes adjusted their shawls. Children were shooed inside and returned in windows like cats. Linh stood at the end of the bridge with a basket of thread, as if this were a day when she might sell notions. The beads at her throat felt heavy as coins. Marchand walked the length of the span. He had a piece of chalk in his pocket and iron in his step. The commissaire gestured. A man laughed. Marchand did not. When he reached the center, he bent and pressed the chalk to the iron and drew a mark no one would see again once the work began. "Teeth," he said under his breath, and Linh, watching from too far to lip read, felt the word in her own mouth. Men set to work with the weary joy of those who know how to lift. The iron sang against itself, and the river, not consulted, hummed an older song. Lin's fingers in the basket closed around the little knife she used to cut thread. She eased it out and pressed it to the cloth lining inside the basket, cutting a pocket into which she placed nothing. It soothed her to make a space. Somewhere behind her, Bao held up his hands to the girls to indicate patience. He did it like a man showing the length of a fish. The span did not fall. It was lifted, slowly, as if the bridge were a person willing to undergo surgery. Marchand watched with the attention of a father and a pilferer. When the last bracket was loose, the span swung like a hammock and then was gone. The hole in the bridge had the honesty of a missing tooth. The city sighed. You could not cross it there anymore. You would have to go down to water, into boats, into men's arms. Linh felt the map tremble against her as if it were alive and cold. She pressed her palm flat against her ribs, forgetting in the act that there were people on either side who might think the gesture theatrical. Later, under the banyan, he came. She did not know if he had been sent by guilt or by a habit of walking. He stood without his rope, without the chalk, without the nothing he often carried to rooms to make it into something. He said, "I have broken my bridge," and it was a confession no priest in the colony had ears for. "You have opened a mouth," she said. "We will learn to speak across it and to see it." He looked at her as if she had suggested the river change its mind. "If I said I am tired," he said, "would it matter?" "It would matter to you," she said, and the cruelty in the truth was also its kindness. "I am tired too." "Then sit," he said, and for a moment it was almost possible that they were a man and a woman in a city without flags, finding a bench that held them both without asking what language they loved in. They did not sit. Standing, as if the ground were still negotiating with them, they allowed themselves to be tired together. Above them, the banyan held its leaves close, a mother embarrassed by her children's insistence that they are grown. Across the water, lanterns embroidered the night. "Tell me something I can fix," he said at last. "A torn seam," she said, because she was not prepared to be worse than ironic. "A loose board, a list of names that says no one I love." She swallowed. "I cannot make you more than you are. I can only refuse to make you less. And I," he said haltingly, "cannot make you safe. I can only tell you the patrol turns left an hour earlier tomorrow." She nodded. It was the old equation. His information for her courage. She ought to hate it. She did not. "Good night, Henri," she said, tasting his name without the weight of monsieur. And it was an intimacy that did not require a button to be undone. "Good night, Linh," he said, and it put them briefly in a house with one lamp, 2 cups, a wet towel over the chair back to cool the room. It put them in a future without a sledgehammer. When she returned to the shop, Bao was trimming paper with a knife sharpened into patience. He looked up and lifted an eyebrow that had too quickly learned to be a question. "You smell of trees," he said. "I was with the banyan," she said. And then, because Bao had been allowed to know everything since before they could count, she added, "and a man." He did not play the brother because he was tired of theater. "Is he an enemy?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and sometimes a door that opens when you lean. Holding the Dasan, then lean," he said, and the magnanimity made her love him more than was easy. "But keep your feet under you." She placed her hand on his hair, where it had grown uneven in this month of forgetting barber chairs. "Always," she said, and the word was less a promise than a direction. In the dark, when the house had fallen into the silence of people who must wake early to move again, Linh lay on her mat and put her palm flat on her stomach, where the map lay quiet. "You will carry us," she whispered to the river sewn into the cloth, and to the river beyond walls, and to the river inside her that had learned to make a boat out of a word. "You will carry us until we grow banks and can't see. But our peace." In her dream, she and Henri marched across a span that did not exist, each of them carrying on their shoulders a beam made of letters. On the other shore, Bao stood with the girls, each holding out a piece of chalk like a candle. The chalk did not light, because chalk is not for fire. It is for leaving a mark that looks fragile and refuses to be. Chapter 3. Banks we build. On the dawn after the tooth was pulled from the bridge, Hanoi woke to the sound of buckets. Men and boys lifted river water and threw it back at the river as if insult were an effective dike. The Red River had crept all night along the base of the embankment, nosing like a dog that had remembered where a bone was buried. By morning it pressed its chest against the city with the casual strength of something that has never doubted itself. Linh stood on the dike with her basket of thread and watched water learn the angle of a street. The sky had lowered itself, a lid too near the pot. She could feel the map in her owl shift as she breathed, as if the river sewn to her body wanted to correct the river outside. Beside her, Bao squinted through the fine rain that always arrived before the real rain. He held a coil of rope that was not strong enough, and knew it. "The dike will hold if it believes itself," he said. "Then speak to it like a lover," Linh said. And their shared smile was the kind of jewelry no law could tax. People moved with the efficiency of old fear, raising mats onto shelves, lifting jars of rice onto tables that had not been trusted with such honor in years, tying chickens to rafters with complex knots learned from fathers who had tied boats to poles. The bridge, suddenly gapped, looked not broken but in the middle of a thought. It had been made into a sentence that ended with an ellipsis. The river read it and smirked. "Tonight," Bao said, "we move the books to Shoan's upper room. We will send the smallest girls to the weaver's house on the rise. If the patrols ask about the bundles, we say they are mats." He ran a thumb over a rope burn as if to rehearse the future pain. "Tonight," Linh answered. She thought of the kiln doors nailed shut and of Shoan's hammer, faithful as a dog. She thought of Kwang's name on fish paper. She was careful with thinking these days. It could drown a person faster than water. By mid-morning, the commissaire's notice men appeared as if called by the smell of wet wood. They carried boards with proclamations, prices for rice during flood, fines for hoarding, penalties for rumor. The men nailed the boards to posts with the solemnity of priests. The board said nothing about the hole in the bridge. "Look," a boy muttered to Linh as she passed the market gate. "They have written a price for listening." He was 15 and already learning to be thin everywhere but the mouth. She pressed a coin into his palm and said, Take your sister to the weavers. Bring back news, not trouble." He ran with the decision to obey like a bird skimming the surface of a lake. "Henri is on the bridge," the clerk with the shaving scar told her when she slipped into the office of public order with a basket of pins that hid a folded letter. "He hasn't eaten. The commissaire says this is what comes of letting engineers entertain ideas." "What ideas?" Lynn asked, though she already knew. The idea that a bridge could be a mouth, the idea that a man could make a choice sideways to the command. "The idea," the clerk said, lowering his voice, "that maps are not just paper." He winked without levity. "I have a niece. She knows your girls. They are sewing their names into their sleeves now, so if they are carried away they won't be lost to themselves." He looked briefly frightened by his own confession, then, "Brave, go," he said. "Don't be seen." She turned to leave and almost collided with Marchand at the threshold. For a second their faces were too near to keep history between them. He smelled of iron and rain. The collar of his shirt had been thumbed until it no longer lay right. He stepped back as if the air needed to be folded between them again. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and it was not a reprimand. It was a man who had learned to identify where lightning liked to stand. "I am everywhere I must be," she said, steady. "We are moving the books tonight." He nodded once, as if this were the answer to a question he had not dared ask. "There will be patrols at the lower street," he said quietly. "Take the alley by the lime kiln, the one with the broken wall." His maiden nose. "You are very free with their secrets," she said, but with a softness that surprised them both. "And you are hungry." He blinked, thrown by the intimacy of a practical observation. She reached into the basket and took out a steamed rice cake wrapped in banana leaf. It had been meant for Bao. She placed it in his hand, because generosity is sometimes rebellion. "Eat before you drown," she said. His mouth opened to say merci and closed on the Vietnamese thank you instead. "Cameron," he said, careful with tones. The words were clumsy in his mouth and dear for their clumsiness. The rain began in earnest at dusk, a rain made of strings. It pulled the city into a different shape. Women moved through it with their hair wrapped, the way they moved through years. Men pretended the rain favored them. Children took their shirts off because it made them lightning-proof in their own logic. Above it all, the commissaire's lamps made puddles of light that did not know which direction to run. The books moved in bundles that looked like mats. Bao took the heaviest stacks because he believed the world would notice if he did not. Zoan walked in front with her hammer, an ordinary woman who had been granted a temporary title by necessity. Lin took the rear with the girls, counting their heads, their shoulders, the way their feet knew a courtyard by the sound it made. They had almost reached the lime kiln when the men in red sashes found their rein. 5 of them, hats tilted to throw water onto other people, boots proud to be themselves. The mustache was with them. He had learned to hold his hat differently in the rain, which gave him the small dignity of someone who had practiced not drowning and succeeded twice. "What is this?" he asked in French, and then, seeing it was Lin who stood at the rear, in Vietnamese. "A boat made of paper? A wedding underwater?" He peered at the bundles. "Mats?" His voice made the word into a promise he hoped to break. "Mats," Zoan said cheerfully. She lifted one end of her bundle and let water run from it like proof. "For sleeping on, for children to remember dreams on when the ground is too wet." "Open one," the sash man demanded, because nothing is more intoxicating than the instruction to ruin someone's order. "Open it," Zoan agreed quickly, to the girl's tiny alarm. She slit the twine with her own knife and peeled back the mat. It was, gloriously, a mat. She had disguised the books inside her skirt, bundling them around her hips like a second woman. Linh loved her in that moment, with the pure, ungenerous love you feel for those who save you from your own plan. The mustache watched water drip from the mat and seemed to decide that he had been thwarted not by wit, but by the elements, which allowed him to keep his self-respect dry. "Move along," he said, "to your dreams." He gestured toward the alley. He did not look at Linh because he had once watched her claim a piece of chalk and had not yet forgiven himself for letting her keep everything that mattered. They moved. At the broken wall by the lime kiln, Bao and Shoan passed the bundles over into the arms of the boy with the mouth, the clerk's niece, the one-eyed man with his rooster, now perched on the ledge as if it were also a citizen. Books crossed like refugees, spines knocking, pages shivering. Linh lifted the last bundle and felt the weight shift as if a fish had decided to live. "You are learning to be a river," Bao murmured as he took it. "You carry everything and leave nothing behind but silt." "Silt grows rice," she said, but she was already counting again. Later, after the last book had been persuaded into Joanne's upper room, after the girls had been sent in pairs to the weavers, after Bao had collapsed on the mat like a man who had been permitted to be useless for 6 minutes, Linh stood at the doorway and watched the rain knit the street. The beads at her throat had that cold that turns to skin only after stubbornness. She lifted them and let them fall again. Their small sound was the sound of a certain childhood. Somewhere in the dark, a camera clicked like a cricket. She turned and did not see him. She did not need to. The sound had the careful hunger she knew. He was near enough to be called. She did not call. The photograph, if it had been taken, would be of a door with rain in front of it and a woman who had learned to be seen exactly as much as she wished. At dawn, the river climbed the last hand's breadth, and then, like a man who had reached the waist-high point where pride begins to look ridiculous, it paused. The dike held. Buckets slowed. Women lowered their arms. Men laughed in the way of people who had survived something that had not decided to kill them yet. The red river settled its chin on the bank and smiled with too many teeth. "The kiln," Bao said immediately, because the world was never done doing its other things. "They will come to nail it again. We will be there first." They were. The kiln door had learned the path of the hammer and opened under Zoan's hand as if it were a girl choosing to be convinced. Linh wrote on the plank with her best chalk, "If you can say it, it exists." The girls, drawn by the law of children to any room that old words had warmed, slipped in and took their places as if the past 2 days had been the weather and this the climate. They had been working for an hour when footsteps came at the speed of bad news. Not the red sashes heavier, boots that had never belonged to Vietnamese feet. Linh felt the map under her hand pull with her pulse. She folded the lesson like a shirt. "Stay," she told the girls, and knew it was a command the world did not recognize. She went to the door and saw Marchand arrive with 2 soldiers she had not met. Pale men with faces the color of new paper. He gestured to them, and they peeled away to look busy elsewhere, the way dogs are sent to sniff while men speak. "You must go," he said without preface or apology. "They have orders from the commissaire to make examples. They will not settle for chalk today." His voice was low and angry, the kind of anger that saves its heat for the right room. "And you?" she asked, because he looked as if he had run with iron in his hands for a week. "If I go, do you stay and make the example of yourself?" "I will be the one who discovered that no one was here," he said. It was not heroism. It was mathematics. Bow, Lin began, but Bow was already moving. He had gathered the slates into a bundle as if they were children. The girls stood, surprised not by fear, but by the abruptness of adult bodies. So Anne herded them with her hands and her eyebrows, making a corridor where no architecture existed. Marchand stepped back to make room and then forward because he could not help himself. "We will take the alley by the fish smoker," he said. "Cut to the tinsmiths. The patrol turns left at the temple." "I know this city," Lin said, not unkindly. "I am learning," he said, and if the situation had been less urgent, it would have been a soft exchange, the kind that fills afternoons in books. They moved. The kiln emptied like a lung. Outside, rain paused as if to listen. Lin took the last child's hand, the small boy with the permanent mouth, and put it on her skirt. "Hold," she said. He did, his hand a hot brand of need. They did not outrun the patrol. They outthought it. At the temple, they turned not left but into the courtyard and through the room where the caretaker kept jars of pickled plums. The caretaker was Lin's father's cousin and had been born with a crooked foot that kept him from soldiering and positioned him perfectly for life with keys. He held the door open with a kind of small joy. At the tinsmith's, steam made a curtain that no soldier would lift for fear of making his suit smell of labor. They moved under it like fish under a lotus leaf. At the alley, the rooster perched on its ledge again, looking bored by the return of history. The city altered its shape to accommodate them. It was a kindness that did not expect thanks. They reached the shop with the ancestor tablet and the dish of beads. Bao set the slates down as if they were sleeping infants, and then bent over, hands on knees. Lin pressed her palm to the tablet and felt wood that had known 1,000 small panics. She turned to Marchand, because it would have been ungrateful not to. "You have become very expensive," she said. He looked at her with an expression that had finally learned to belong to his face. "And you," he said, "are bankrupting me." He said it without regret. Bao straightened. "We will repay you in ballads," he said dryly. "They will be sung to children who do not yet exist and will not be grateful." "Those are the only true payments," Marchand said, surprising himself again. He looked toward the door as if it had the remainder of a sentence he needed. "Lin," he began, and stopped because he almost never said her name without a breath later to pay for it. "They have a list," he said instead. "Your name is not on it. Bao's is." He did not look at Bao when he said it, a courtesy. "Then we will cut up the list," Bao said lightly, but his eyes flickered with the knowledge of paper's power. "You will hide," Marchand said to him, in the tone of a man suggesting a seating arrangement. "Tonight, there is a freight barge leaving from the far bank. Brushes and barrels, I can put you on it." He turned to Lin. "It will not be safe to return for some time. Nam Din, perhaps, or farther." His mouth formed a word he did not say. "Saigon, no," Lin said, before the map could vibrate itself out of her ribs. It was not a romantic no. It was the no of architecture. He will not leave the river. He will move along it. She looked at Bao. "The ferry house at Bat Trang, Uncle Tam. It. He Bao nodded in the same beat. "He owes us 2 bowls of noodles," he said. "We will collect them by sleeping on his floor." Marchand ran a hand over his face and left a brief smear of iron. "I cannot protect you in Bat Trang," he said, as if the statement were new to his tongue. The idea that he could not protect, the admission that he had been trying. "But they will look for you here first. Then you must make them look somewhere else." Lin said. "You are good at arranging weights." "I can," he said slowly. "Misfile a notice. I can conduct a search at the wrong hour. I can instruct a man to measure a door that does not matter." He raised his eyes to hers. "I can send a photograph to Saigon that will not arrive." "Do that," Lin said, "and then sleep." "I do not sleep," he said, almost proud of the flaw he had chosen. "I rehearse." "Rehearse drowning?" she asked gently. It was the old joke, kind now. "Rehearse the opposite," he said. "It is like practicing a bridge in your head." That evening, the city looked like a painting a Frenchman would make and get wrong. Lanterns hung where none were needed. Water held the lamp's reflections hostage and negotiated release by adding ripples. Men played chess under the eaves and moved pieces without pairs. Women folded clothes that would not fully dry until the next season. Children practiced the word for flood with the relish of new vocabulary. Bao left after midnight with a bundle that looked like a poorly planned picnic. He did not make speeches because neither of them wanted to pay the cost of unmade ones. He kissed their father's sleeping head and left a thumbprint on the ancestor tablet by accident. He put his hand on the rooster's back in the alley, and the rooster tolerated it for the sake of tradition. He hugged Lin with one arm. "You have our mother's hands," he said, which was the most extravagant thing he had ever allowed himself. "You have her stubbornness," she returned. "Do not spend it all at once." "He's can't," he nodded, and then, for once, obeyed without argument. He slipped into water and did not become a cautionary tale. The ferry house at Bat Trang would hide him in clay and bowls. He would move along the river like a rumor that refused to be either confirmed or denied. The next morning, the commissaire's men arrived with a box of nails and the desire to put the world back where paper said it belonged. They did not find Bao. Marchand looked at the hinged empty places in Lin's house and read absence the way a good man reads the air before a storm. He did not smile. He told the mustache to check the wrong street. After the search had spent itself on drawers that contained only thread and letters that named only the dead, Lin carried her basket to the banyan. The rain had finally quit. The air tasted like metal and forgiveness. She touched the trunk and felt a story older than theirs and located in the same muscles. He came late. The camera hung at his chest, not as a shield but as a confession. He looked at her for a long time before he said anything, as if measuring the safe length of silence was a thing men of his nation were trained in. "The list is misfiled," he said. "If anyone asks me for it, I will look for it for an hour and find a different paper that will anger them more." His smile was small and wicked, briefly the face of a boy who had once stolen an apple and shared it with the person he liked. "Bao?" she asked. "He is moving where I cannot see him," he said, and it hurt him to admit both halves. "Which means he is safer than those I can see." "Thank you," she said, "and let the gratitude be plain as a bowl." He took it like a man who had not eaten and did not make a face over the taste. "Lin," he said, and this time there was no monsieur anywhere near the name. "I cannot stay." The words were a rope that had frayed. "They will send me to Haiphong to work on the port, or farther north to the mountains where bridges are short and men are fewer." He lifted the camera and then let it fall. "Too many photographs I did not file. Too many doors opened at the wrong hour. Relief and grief are a matched set. They arrive together." She exhaled something between them. "When?" she asked. "Soon?" he said, which was a cruel word in any language. They stood with the banyan, sharing their weight, and did what people do before the shape of their lives changes. They pretended it would not. They spoke of weather, they spoke of the price of rice, of the way iron smelled in rain, of a book about stars that had traveled the city like a contraband comet. He told her that cathedrals are repaired more than they are built. She told him that women fold the same shirt into different lives. When she had laughed once and he had smiled twice and the tree had decided they were children who could be trusted not to break its lowest branch, she said, "Henri." He looked at her the way the river looks at a bend it has made in a particularly satisfying way. "Yes, take a photograph," she said. "Not of me." She pointed to the ground. "Of this space. So when you are elsewhere, you remember the room we made of air." He lifted the camera obediently, then reverently, then in the way of a man who is doing a thing that will cost him later. He framed the patch of ground where their feet had been, the lowest roots of the banyan that made a sentence of the soil. The lamplight pooled like mercy. He clicked. The sound, freed from the usual apology it carried, was suddenly simply a record. "I will not send it," he said. "I know," she answered. "You will keep it between your shirt and your heart, and it will make you heavier, and that will keep you from being blown off bridges in storms." He lowered the camera and laughed. It shook rain from his lashes that had not been there. "You are never not practical," he said. "It is a decision," she replied. He touched the beads at her throat. He did not ask permission with words because his hand asked more eloquently and slowly enough to be refused. She did not refuse. His thumb brushed glass that had learned her heat. "I will remember this color," he said quietly, "in places where the light is wrong." "Take one," she said, and she did not know until she said it that she would. She untied the string, and the beads lay in her palm like a lake. She slid one bead free. It took a surgeon's patience and a thief's disrespect for knots. She pressed the bead into his hand and closed his fingers around it. "For courage," she added, and watched his mouth understand what her mother had meant. He did not say the great things men say in books. He did not swear or promise or argue with the river. He put the bead in his pocket with the care of a man placing a small animal somewhere it could breathe. Then he looked at her, with the ease of a man who had finally practiced the exact angle of a goodbye. "You will go on teaching," he said. "I will," she said, "in courtyards, kilns, ferry houses, under tables, everywhere a mouth can open." "You will love," he said. It was not a question and not a command. "I do," she said, and it was an answer that did not tell on anyone. When he left, the banyan let a leaf fall with spectacular timing. It landed on his shoulder and stayed there until the corner, where it chose the air. Linh watched him go until history turned the lane. Weeks unscrolled. The river subsided, grumbling. Chouan's hammer developed a personality and a certain authority. The kiln opened and closed like an old uncle's mouth. The commissaire reassigned his lamplighter to a different route because the light's insistence had begun to irritate him personally. The mustache grew out and then in again. The men in red sashes learned to dislike mud. The girls added new letters to their sleeves and did not grow any less sharp. Bao sent word on a shard of pottery, an inked symbol that only children and the very patient would recognize as the sign for still. He was still. He was still moving. He was still himself. Linh wore the shard in her pocket until the edge taught a hole in the cloth, and then she mended it and wore it again. One evening, months later, when Jasmine had returned to the parts of the city that permit such softness, a boy arrived with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. He did not know who had given it to him. He had been told to bring it to the woman who taught by making girls say the names of rivers out loud until they sounded like music. He handed it to Linh and ran, because messengers are always made of flight. Inside the paper was a little box no larger than a man's palm. Inside the box, a photograph. Not of the banyan, he had kept that one as instructed. This photograph showed a plank, a span not quite yet a span, iron resting on river, a jaw not yet closed. And in the corner of the frame, almost an accident, the curve of a woman's owl where it folded at her waist. No faces, no names. The world, if it had to interpret, would see work. Linh, in the secret room where she and the river lived, saw a promise to keep remembering the absence they had made together. Beneath the photograph lay a single sheet of paper. On it, in a hand that had learned to lean in the right direction, 3 lines in Vietnamese. The tones were nearly perfect. I am learning your river by heart. Every bridge is painted over and over, but the water keeps the first color. She sat at the back table, where once she had sewed a map into cloth with a needle that pricked her into belief, and read the lines aloud. The sound made the room into the exact room it was, a shop with ink on the air and fear on the floor, and a future at the door pretending to be a customer. Bao came in with clay under his nails from a trip to Bat Trang that had lasted 10 hours and a decade. He saw the photograph and picked it up by the edges, respectful as a temple boy. He read the lines and snorted what in other men would have been a laugh. "Your Frenchman has learned tone marks," he said. "There is no saving him now." "He is not mine," she said automatically. "He is yours in the way a bridge is yours," Bao said, kinder than his mouth liked to be. "It does not belong to you. You belong to a city that uses it until the river asks it to be something else." He set the photograph down. "Will you answer? I have nothing to send that will not tie him tighter to the wrong place," she said. She touched the corner of the image. "I will answer here." "And how do you answer here?" Bao asked, and the question held no slyness. "By keeping this room full," she said simply. "By not letting the river in except when it comes as girls with wet feet and new words." So they did. They taught. They built banks out of pronouns and chalk. They used recipes to conceal geography, lullabies to smuggle arithmetic. They taught the boys, too, when it could be done without attracting men who measured the wrong doors. They made a grammar of survival and spoke it until it was as natural as breath. Sometimes, on a particular angle of morning, when light slid along the tin roof and fell onto the table like a letter without a name, Linh would take the photograph from its box and look at it with the shameless attention she allowed very few things. She would imagine a bead in a pocket touching a matchbox, a key, a string. She would say in her head, not out loud because her head had earned its privacy, "Henri," and then return to the business of a city that required her hands. Years later, when the bridge had long since learned a new span and the river had taken back every nail men had ever refused to let rust, when the commissaire had been replaced by a man with a similar love of paper, when the mustache had become a face you thought you remembered from an era when men believed hats could keep them dry, a story would be told at the weaver's house on rain nights. It would be told by a woman whose sleeves were neat with letters and whose hair had the streaks of white that looked like rules in the right light. She would tell of a time when girls learned to hide sentences in hymns and when a man who built bridges took out his own tooth and left a gap that the city turned into a mouth for singing. She would not use names. Children listening would supply their own. In the story, the woman always wore a river against her ribs. In the story, The man carried a bead that a city had minded into his pocket. In the story, the river always rose and the dike always held, and sometimes they traded places, but people learned both ways to breathe. One of the girls from the kiln, now a mother who had discovered the cold pleasure of scolding a child into safety, would ask, "And did they ever cross?" She would mean, "Did they ever find a way to be in a room with only two people?" And the old grammar of mouths, and the woman, who had once been Linh and had never been anyone else, even when she needed to be, would say, "Every day." It would not be a lie. She would mean the crossing you do when you hand a chalk to a hand that does not know it is a torch, the crossing you do when you cut a thread and pull a seam and reveal a map that had waited in the dark for a brave moment. On a certain evening, when the jasmine was almost discourteous with its insistence, she would lock the shop door and sit at the back table and take out the photograph again. She would place it beside the ancestor tablet and the dish where the blue beads lay, now a little cloudy because glass remembers breath. She would strike a match and light a joss stick and place it in the sand. Smoke would rise like handwriting. "Mother," she would say to the wood that had not changed and to the river that could not help it, "We did not drown." She would place her palm against the map that had been washed and mended and re-sewn into a newer owl when time had asked for such repairs. We learned too many words for water. At the banyan, children would climb the lowest branch and hang upside down until the world's blood went to their faces and returned wiser. A woman with ink on her wrist would straighten a poster and pretend to hate the way the wind played with it. A clerk with a scar would close a drawer with the satisfaction of a nail in the right place. Somewhere far north or south or beyond, a man would touch his pocket without meaning to, and find his fingers warmed by glass. And the river, pleased with itself for reasons it seldom bothers to explain, would shoulder past the bridge's legs and go about its old, tireless business of carving, of carrying, of speaking all the names people have for it, and the one it has for itself.